Welcome back to another book highlight. We have now reached chapter 36, and we have been moving forward with chunks of chapters, but I want to hone in on chapter 36 a little bit and look at the key conversation that starts to unravel David and Mephi's relationship, heading for the climax of the story, because there's some very important takeaways here with regards to communication. And for some biblical context here, it's 2 years after David's oldest son, Amnon, raped his half-sister, Tamar, and it's right before Absalom kills him for that. So we're starting to see the violence break out in David's house because of his sin with Bathsheba. He repented, but this is the consequence playing out. Mephi and David are trying to be vulnerable with each other in this conversation and share their hearts, even though it's awkward. Basically, Mephi's trying to let David know what he's afraid of, and David is trying to ease his fear. But what's getting in the way for them, and what often gets in our way in communication, is pride. Pride triggers offense, and that is super dangerous in communication because it blocks us from hearing what the person is truly saying, and then it causes us to harden our hearts, and we can't see a solution. All we see is this person telling us what we're doing wrong, and in an effort to preserve our ego and continue to believe we're doing everything right, we allow things to happen that hurt others. And so I want to quickly go over some of the misunderstandings that take place in this conversation and what we can learn from them. Again, this is a fictional conversation in a real setting, but as I always try to do with the artistic license in my novels, it fits the situation and the characters. My character, Mephi, is dealing with a reasonable fear in light of his real situation in David's court. He can't walk, and he's part of Saul's unpopular household, and so he's really dependent on David for the safety of his family. All the power in their relationship belongs to David, and as Mephi is seeing things unravel because of David's sin, he's nervous because David hasn't dealt with Amnon's crime against Tamar yet. He hasn't punished him at all, and Mephi worries that David isn't strong enough to protect him if he can't protect his own daughter. So that's the premise here is biblical, and I think it makes sense with the story. This conversation makes sense with the real story. Mephi is worried about the implications of David's passivity and how it might affect others in the kingdom like him who are dependent on the king's protection. And this is a normal thing to be afraid of. I think it's something we can relate to. When you don't see justice being upheld in a certain way, it's natural to be concerned about the implications for you and your family's future. And that's what Mephi's trying to share with David, but it's poking David in all the places that hurt. On page 492, Mephi says, "I can't resist the wealth I feel in David's presence. As much as the current circumstances pain me, I can't deny that Israel's king is one of a very rare kind." And this expresses why it's so tough to be in Mephi's position and something we can relate to. It's hard enough to imagine confronting a random person, but it's painful when you're struggling to trust a fellow Christian as someone that you have a rich, godly relationship with. It's tough to imagine setting boundaries with them or hurting them. It's really painful. But this is the first communication point I want to make here. If you love someone, you will address these things with them personally and not allow it to devolve into bitterness or gossip. It's actually a sign of strength to fight for the relationship by not letting this get between you unnoticed. On page 493, we see the main misunderstanding from David's point of view. David has been acting like Mephi's loyalty is settled and doesn't ever need to be revisited. And this is a very easy mistake to make as a leader, but we can also make it with our spouses, kids, friends. It's easy to think that because I take care of you in this one way, or I pray for you, or I was there for you in a tough time, or I did a good deed, you can let the whole relationship hinge on that and not check in on its health over time. It's a lazy view that really relies on the past. Mephi feels kind of insulted that David thinks his loyalty is settled because he has Saul's house. But none of that means he should ignore what's happening now. And this is a good thing to remember. This is a way that people gaslight each other. Didn't I do this good thing for you? And perhaps that's true, but that doesn't mean you don't have a point that needs to be addressed. And if a person pulls this card, or if you find yourself doing it, it's likely a defense mechanism because it's hard being told you're not doing enough. The other misunderstanding here between David and Mephi is that David thinks that Mephi and Jonathan are kind of the same. David takes offense over the bursting of his bubble because he's thinking Mephi wants to push him away, but Mephi's just being honest. He's saying, I'm not my father. I don't have the luxury of doing everything like he could. I need to know if you care about me for myself and are willing to stand up for me if something went wrong. And rather than hearing that plea, David is choosing to take offense and hear discontentment and lack of gratitude. He already knows he's failing with his own kids, and he's very sensitive to criticism right now, but he's allowing that offense to get in the way. And that's another problem we can allow to cloud our judgment. We can often act like because someone is a close friend or family member, they'll automatically act the way we've been picturing them acting in our head, and we get offended when that doesn't happen. We need to make sure we're apprehending who someone really is, not how we'd imagine or desire them to be. David isn't getting the answer he wants, and therefore he's offended, but it's so much better to put aside your pride and listen, because then you can arrive at a solution and possibly save the relationship. On page 495 and 96, David gets vulnerable for a moment and tells Mephi how important he is to him. And Mephi thinks, well, if you appreciate me that much, why don't you listen? And this is another issue. We often don't think that we need our actions to line up with our declarations about people. If someone is actually that valuable to you, you need to put aside your pride long enough to hear their concerns and fight for them. No one likes to hear that they aren't perfect, but if you care more about preserving the relationship, you'll ask God for the wisdom to hear clearly and be guided by the Spirit into a solution, even if it hurts your pride initially. It's devastating to find out that someone close to you isn't feeling your love the way you wanted them to, especially if you feel like you've done right by them already. And this isn't about taking on guilt, but at the very least, you can get the relationship back to a baseline of regaining trust rather than allowing the fissure to get even wider until you can't even trace it back to its original source. Right now, it's not a fight between David and Mephi personally, but a lot of ominous circumstances are mounting, and Mephi decides to make a hard decision for the health and safety of his family, and David takes offense at that, believing Mephi should just trust him more. And his offense continues to widen the gulf between them, making Mephi more vulnerable to the evil voices that have been biding their time, waiting to get to him. And yes, it is Mephi's responsibility, as it is ours, to guard against negative influences, and we have the Spirit to help us with that. But it's awful when we don't take care of each other and those offenses leave us vulnerable to attacks that didn't have to happen. So if you're facing a misunderstanding or a hurt or a concern with someone you love, humble yourself, pray, and ask God what you can do to draw proper boundaries and take care of those who are valuable to you. If you're offended by the cries of people close to you, ask yourself, is it worth it losing them just to keep my pride intact, or can I put aside that pride and receive what they're actually saying and figure out how to guard what we have if it's that important?